There are mistakes that fade quietly into the background of a baseball game. They get absorbed by the next at-bat, buried under the next inning, forgotten before the final out is recorded. And then there are mistakes that sit in the air. The kind that change the temperature of a dugout. The kind that you can feel in the silence between pitches. The kind that settle on a player's shoulders and don't lift easily, no matter how many teammates walk past and say the right things. What Teoscar Hernandez experienced in that moment was the second kind. And what Shohei Ohtani did about it, quietly, without announcement, with the timing of someone who understood exactly what the room needed, was the kind of thing that doesn't show up in any box score ever printed. The game had been tight in the way that October-flavored September games tend to be tight. Every pitch carrying slightly more weight than it should. Every out feeling like a small negotiation. The Dodgers were managing it. Not comfortably, but well enough. The pitching had been holding. The lineup had been grinding. The scoreboard had the kind of numbers that make a manager's jaw unclench just slightly. And then the ball went to right field. It was the kind of fly ball that Hernandez had caught 1,000 times. The trajectory wasn't deceptive. The lighting wasn't an excuse. It was the kind of play that, on most nights, ends with a routine squeeze and a jog back to the dugout. He lost it. The ball skipped off the heel of his glove and the runners moved, and by the time the inning was over, 2 runs had crossed the plate that weren't supposed to be there. 2 runs that had come directly from his hands. 2 runs that now lived permanently in the box score with his name written invisibly beside them. The dugout went quiet in the way that dugouts go quiet when everyone is trying very hard not to say anything wrong. Hernandez came back to the bench and sat down. The people nearest to him said later that he didn't slam anything. He didn't throw his helmet. He didn't do any of the things that signal external anger. He just sat. Shoulders slightly forward. Eyes somewhere in the middle distance. The particular stillness of a man who is having a very loud conversation entirely inside his own head. His teammates knew the look. They had all worn it at some point. The look that comes after the kind of mistake that can't be undone, only survived. In baseball, silence in a dugout is its own kind of language. It communicates things that words can't without making them worse. It gives a player space to feel what he's feeling without being crowded by well-meaning voices that arrive too quickly and solve nothing. But it also has a weight to it. Left alone too long, it starts to compress. It starts to feel less like space and more like a verdict. The Dodgers' dugout was approaching that second kind of silence. Pitching changes were being discussed at one end. Lineup considerations were being mapped at another. But in the middle of all of it, there was Teoscar Hernandez, sitting with 2 runs that shouldn't have scored and an inning that couldn't be replayed, and the particular quiet of a man who has decided, at least temporarily, that the jury is still deliberating. Shohei Ohtani had been watching. Not obviously. Not in the way that draws attention to the watching. He was doing what he usually did in the dugout, being present, taking in the game, existing in that particular state of focused calm that seems to come naturally to him in ways that baffle people who have spent their entire careers trying to manufacture it. But he had seen Hernandez come back to the bench. He had registered the shoulders. The stillness. The eyes. And he had made a calculation that had nothing to do with baseball. Nobody announced it. There was no signal from the coaching staff. No teammate nudged Ohtani and said, "Go say something to Teo." It didn't work that way. The thing that happened next happened because Ohtani decided, on his own timeline and in his own way, that the moment had arrived. He sat down next to Hernandez. Not across from him. Not at a careful, respectful distance that communicated sympathy without intimacy. He sat right next to him, in the ordinary way that you sit next to someone you are completely comfortable with, and he said something. The translator wasn't there. The cameras didn't catch the words. What the cameras did catch, and what the people in the dugout described afterward in fragments, each one adding a slightly different detail, was what happened after the words. Hernandez looked up. And then, slowly, with the reluctance of a man who had decided he wasn't going to smile for a while, he smiled. Not a big smile. Not the kind that signals that everything is fine and the moment has been fully processed and the weight has been lifted completely. It was smaller than that. It was the first crack in something that had been sealed shut since the ball hit the grass in right field. But in a dugout that had gone quiet in the wrong way, that small smile was the loudest thing that happened. Dave Roberts had seen it from the corner of his eye. He didn't make a show of it. He didn't pause the conversation he was having with his bench coach to point it out. But he saw it, and later, when a reporter asked him about Ohtani's presence in the dugout, not his pitching, not his batting, but his presence, Roberts took a moment before he answered. There are players, he said slowly, who understand the game inside the lines. And then there are players who understand everything around the game too. Shohei is the second kind. He paused there. What he did with Teo today, I didn't ask him to do that. Nobody did. He just read the room and knew what was needed. The reporter followed up, asking what exactly had been said. Roberts shook his head slightly. Not dismissively. More in the way of someone protecting something that deserved to be protected. That stays in the dugout, he said. But whatever it was, it worked. Teoscar Hernandez faced the media after the game with the composure of someone who had decided, somewhere between the final out and the walk to the interview area, that he was going to be honest. He acknowledged the error without softening it. He used the word mistake without flinching. He talked about the 2 runs in a direct way that didn't attempt to distribute the blame or reframe the moment as something more complicated than it was. He had dropped the ball. The runs had scored. That was what happened. But then a reporter asked about the dugout. About what had shifted after he came back to the bench. About the moment that people sitting close enough had noticed and described in careful, partial terms. Hernandez was quiet for a second. Sho came and sat next to me, he said. He stopped there, as if deciding how much of it belonged to him to share. He said something, I don't want to get into exactly what, but it was funny. Like, actually funny. And I didn't want to laugh because I was. He paused. I was still in it, you know? Still in the mistake. And he knew that. I think that's why he said what he said. Because he knew that the only way out of it was through something that had nothing to do with the mistake. He shook his head slightly. That's a different kind of baseball intelligence. That's not something you can teach. The players who had been sitting nearby described the moment the way people describe things they weren't fully prepared to witness. One described it as a release valve, the specific term he used, unprompted, as if he had been searching for the right phrase and that was the one that fit. The tension that had been building since the error, the silence that had been getting heavier with each passing minute, had needed somewhere to go. Ohtani had given it somewhere to go. Another player, speaking in the casual shorthand of a post-game clubhouse, said simply, Sho's been here for less time than most of us, and he already knows how to read every person on this team. That observation landed differently than the ones before it. Because Ohtani had not been in American baseball forever. He had not grown up inside the particular cultural rhythms of a major league clubhouse. He had arrived from somewhere else, carrying a different language and a different set of references, and he had still, somehow, learned to read the room faster and more accurately than people who had been in it for a decade. That said something. Not just about Ohtani the player, but about Ohtani the person. About what he had chosen to pay attention to when he arrived in Los Angeles. About what he had decided mattered beyond the statistics and the mechanics and the preparation that the cameras could see. The Dodgers didn't fold after the 2 runs. They came back, as they tend to come back, through the steady accumulation of at-bats and the management of a bullpen that had been built for exactly this kind of situation. The deficit was addressed. The scoreboard moved in the right direction. And Teoscar Hernandez, in the later innings, made a play in right field that was clean and ordinary and completely unremarkable, which was, in its own way, exactly what it needed to be. He caught the ball. He threw it in. He jogged back to his position. The mistake was not erased. That's not how baseball works. That's not how anything works. But it had been survived. And sitting somewhere in the dugout, between innings, watching the game with the particular focus that never fully leaves his face, Shohei Ohtani had already moved on. Not because the moment hadn't mattered, but because he had done what he came to do, and now there was a game to finish. That was the thing about him that was most difficult to explain to people who hadn't seen it up close. The home runs were easy to understand. The strikeouts were easy to understand. The statistics told a story that any fan anywhere could follow without additional context. But this, the 30 seconds in a dugout, the words that made a man smile when he had decided he wasn't going to, the quiet reading of a room that no camera fully captured, this was the part of Shohei Ohtani that no number had ever been invented to measure. It was also, those who had witnessed it quietly agreed, the part that mattered most.